in the context of evaluating the resources required for workforce development and as a continuation of the ongoing discussions around the resources necessary to fulfill the core mission of the Social Equity Council. There were questions raised about the resources allocated for workforce development and community investment, the relative, the ratio between those two, and just many members of both finance and beyond felt that there should be a focused discussion just to ensure that we are all in alignment on the direction for those two line items since they were so significant. And so I know our executive director, Ginny Rae Clay, will, kind of talk us through some of the assumptions, but Kelly Marie, we recognize the extensive work that you and your committee have done to kind of dig into the impact of what the workforce development component will look like, how much it will cost. And so we are hopeful that during today's call, we can have a better appreciation for some of the underlying assumptions, how those assumptions could change going forward. Again, from finances perspective, making sure that we are aware of the resources necessary to carry out that important function. So I don't know if any other members have comments. I know members of the Finance Committee are really dialed in on some of these issues. So let's have, anyone who wants to ask questions, they can dive right in.
I'm happy to provide kind of an overview of where we're at this point in time, if that would be helpful before we ask a lot of questions. That might clear up some of the questions in advance.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds great. So I think as we are looking at what the workforce demand is going to be, we are kind of in an interesting stage right now because we don't really know what the timeline is for these programs that are going to be in demand to skill people up to take the jobs that are going to be opening in this industry and the various different types of licensings and parts of the industry that need to train people to be effective in their jobs. Now that we've gotten some licenses under our belt, I think it could be beneficial to go back to those licensees and ask them what their timelines are. I'm not sure that, we received that information in the workforce committee. We, in retrospect, every time you do something, there's always opportunities for continuous improvement. We may want to ask to include in the workforce plan a timeline. We did not ask for that in the current rubric and plan. That would have been helpful. But Ginny Rae was helpful in looking at what some other states are doing. And she had a call with Massachusetts and found that in the 3 years that they have been open for recreational cannabis industry, they have 23,000 people working in the industry already. With $3 billion in sales. So I think that it's helpful in providing a little bit of context to the number of people that are going into the industry. When we, all of the work that we've done around workforce development, we use $10,000 as the average cost. And that is not just including the cost of the training program. The training programs are usually typically maybe even less than 50% of those costs, depending on what it is. But we really look at the wraparound costs for childcare, transportation, technology. We've done housing and food stipends. All of the issues that would preclude somebody from being able to effectively participate in a training program, we're mitigating that. We're even giving out stipends for participation. So the cost is really an average cost because some people need a little bit more benefits than other people. We're also working to braid funding sources together. So we're looking at other funded sources for supportive services that could be accessed that would allow us to make our training dollars go further. But all of that, again, is on the average. And looking at that and the number of people that we need to get going in these training programs kind of led us to the numbers that we're at. Now, when we had this conversation, it was really in isolation of all of the other needs around the budget and the money that is coming in. So I've had multiple conversations to date in the last week and a half with Patrick Holland and Ginny Ray Clay on, what are the other obligations and responsibilities that we need to balance the allocation of the workforce dollars against. And that line item with regards to reinvestment back into the community is, that was not on my radar when I was giving these numbers. And it's very appropriate that, $2 million for that in comparison to workforce is a very large disparity. And I agree with that. So a suggestion that I have for this council, this committee, and especially given the fact that we really don't have a solid understanding of the funds that will be available to the Social Equity Council, weighing those projected revenues coming in against the needs of, say, the Department of Consumer Protection, of Department of Motor Vehicle, other agencies that need to be funded through these to support this work. I propose that we look at community reinvestment, and that workforce development is a subcategory of community reinvestment, so that we can flow those funds, because these funds are going to be targeted at the DAI residents and those who have been disproportionately impacted. So workforce development is a form of community development by ensuring people have the skills necessary to participate in the industry. But if we did it as a subcategory, it would give us the opportunity to flow funds to other community reinvestment priorities, and be able to balance those priorities as the timeline requires us to, instead of just fully allocating, a bucket of money for solely workforce development, not taking into consideration the other types of reinvestment that the council would like to make. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm very interested in your response to that suggestion.
Madam Chair, do you have a question?
I do, and thank you. So thank you for thinking about this, Kelly. Sorry, tried to lower my hand. So I think, I guess my primary concern is that all along we have been articulating to the community that the community reinvestment would be organic, right? Meaning that it would come from the community stating to us, this is where we want the dollars to go. So I'm feeling a little conflicted, I guess, while recognizing the needs that may be associated with workforce development, that we not presume as to what communities want that reinvestment to look like. And I'm a strong believer that a lot of times, policymakers will set a table for recipients without inviting them to the table. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are considering the community voice when we're making a determination of this kind of investment.
I think that's a very important consideration here, and not one that I had taken into consideration when I made my suggestion.
Really?
Mayor, thank you. Thank you for that presentation, and I'm in full agreement with what you said to the extent that I can understand it. The question I have is, as we look at this industry, I was struck yesterday when it came up in the Cohn-Resnick hours that was set aside. I attended part of that. The amount of the revenue that is generated, at least in Massachusetts, right? And when I looked at their, so they had about $3.2 billion in revenue, 23,000 employees. So that's about 130,000. They're generating revenue at about $130,000 per employee. And so my thought was, gee, how does that compare to other industries? Because that seems awfully high to me. And so what I'm getting at is workforce development is going to be key to making sure that we have citizens in the state, particularly those from the communities we're trying to focus on, that are prepared to enter this high revenue, and I'm thinking, high paying job market. So I'd like to know a little more about how this industry, do we have any comparisons with this industry compared to other industries in the state? And keeping in mind that if Connecticut does half that number, and they get there in the first 2 or 3 years, that is a tremendous, that's a tremendous a lot of revenue coming up out of nothing, and getting to that kind of point. So, I'm not sure what kind of investment we need, but I figure we're going to need a lot. So as opposed to thinking smaller, I think we better start thinking larger. Because the worst thing that can happen is if we are not prepared to train the people that we want to train to get in this industry. So
I agree with everything that you just said. I don't have a comparison. I think that's an interesting way to make a comparison for how many individuals are working in a field. One of the challenges that we do have in Connecticut is that we don't really have a way of counting for who is in what industry in employment in Connecticut. We don't report that information to the Department of Labor. However, OWS supported an enhanced wage record bill that passed in 2020. It will not go into effect until 2025. We are working with the Department of Labor to be able to capture that data at that point. But I think, how Massachusetts is capturing that data, as Jenny Ray explained to me earlier today, is they're kind of giving out a card for everybody that is working in that industry so that they can track them. We just don't have that data in other industries to make the comparison, but it's a good one.
Right. And, I'm prepared for someone to tell me that those numbers or that ratio is irrelevant. If that's an irrelevant ratio, I'll accept that with an explanation. But it just seems to me that it is relevant to see just what kind of industry are we looking at compared to other. And we know that it's not necessarily going to be labor intensive, right? I'm not. So it's going to be rather capital intensive, I would think. Although there are labor intensive pieces of it. Like I think I toured one facility where they were actually, making there was a portion of the creation of the cigarettes they were doing by hand. So to some extent, it is labor intensive. But with that kind of revenue, it seems to me that there will be high paying jobs. I don't know that, but it just seems to me that there would be, and we should prepare our people to be ready to step into those jobs and into those careers So,
Madam Chair, or Kyle, I don't know who was first. Madam Chair.
Kyle,
go
you
ahead.
want to go?
I think you were first. Go for it.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned, Kelly, earlier, if I understood, that there were 23,000 people participating in the cannabis workforce in Massachusetts. I'm curious to know, right, because obviously we're not the same size. It would be helpful for me to have two pieces of information. One, how does that sort of, from a ratio standpoint, measure to what we anticipate the workforce in Connecticut would look like? And two, I think it would help my comfort level a lot if I knew what the anticipated revenue for Connecticut was. And that's not necessarily a question for you, but it helps me sort of, visualize what piece of, the size of the piece of the pie that we're talking about using for this purpose.
I agree with you completely, Madam Chair. That piece of information is really vital, and I feel like in some ways we're shooting in the dark without having that information.
So I would like to just jump in if I might. Sorry, Kyle, but this conversation is centered around kind of a tenet of economic projections, and that is the multiplier effect. Different industries have kind of predictable rates of economic improvement based on the type of investment. And so capital investments have a certain multiplier effect. I just did a quick and dirty Google search, and by no means this is not authoritative, but according to some cannabis industry sources, there are some who use an economic multiplier of 3.5. So for every $1 invested, that is expected to generate 3.5 additional dollars in measurable economic activity. And so I think what you're getting at, Mr. Shirley or Ed, is, can we update that information? There's another Forbes magazine reported in May of 2022 that a multiplier of 2.8. So if we can, for ourselves, satisfy what, and this, by the way, addresses the scale comment raised earlier, that's a pretty decent way to engage in a back of the envelope estimate of how much input in the way of workforce development will generate how much activity. So I would ask if we can somehow lean into our own state's Department of Labor or other research services that may be able to kind of help us confirm what the right measuring stick would be. But I think that's a good start. So others have endeavored to answer the problem or the question that you've raised. The other comment, just briefly, I would say, Kelly Marie, and that is, it makes sense to me that workforce development is a subset of the community investment piece. And here's why. And I'm sensitive to the points that our chair has raised. But it strikes me that, any investment of dollars, that we do so in a way that is designed to have maximum positive impact, that those investments are sustainable, right? And in my mind, investment in workforce development will have, again, the multiplier effect, a trained workforce. There will be numerous other positive outcomes associated with that. And so in my mind, a very thoughtful approach to investing in workforce development will have the impact of improving the community. These are measurable investments. In my mind, whether something is sustainable and measurable, those are two hallmarks of a successful allocation of public resources. So I think that, conceptually that makes sense to me. And as the maturity of this program changes over time, if we kind of aggregate, or workforce development within the community reinvestment kind of line item, if you will, I think the yearly budget process would allow us to adjust as necessary if we find that we're getting a lot of impact from you know, certain development programs and not such a great return on others. I mean, this is capable, I think, of the kind of measurement in cold hard math, which will help us deploy resources most effectively. So I just wanted to offer that comment. Kyle, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on, but
No,
you have-
it's okay. You sort of touched on my question. I mean, as we try to translate what we've seen in Massachusetts to what we expect in Connecticut, one question I have is a matter of scope and thinking about, all right, we have this new industry in the state. What is the state's responsibility for, you know, which individuals we're going to help train in terms of the workforce, and what is the our business partners, the industry itself, what is their responsibility for training? So are we strictly, as we do for other SEC programs, are we strictly supporting equity applicant businesses? We're specifically targeting community investment areas? I just wanted to be clear as we try to estimate the projected cost of any future workforce programs.
I think that's a good point, Kyle. And, you know, we did ask what people's reinvestment was looking like with regards to workforce development. And we asked them to make some levels of commitment around what those dollars are going to be. And I am looking at some of them here. And I don't think we really got, you know, a huge definitive answer on how much money people were going to actually thinking about being able to reinvest back in. It's kind of something that we weren't able to really hold them to those numbers.
Yeah. And one other thing I'm thinking about, and if we're going to try and do this comparison, is maybe looking at the number of licenses they have in Massachusetts as compared to what we're authorizing. That may be another helpful metric for comparing. And
I think we have the outlines of a pretty good economic analysis based on these questions. We could figure it out.
Ed?
Thanks. First, I think that Christine made an excellent point with the reference to multiplier effect. I mean, particularly from a public policy area, I can see how important that is for us to quantify or to try to quantify. And also, Andrea's point is something that you know, I have not seen. I guess it exists, but just what are the projections for revenue in recreational cannabis, or just the recreation and medical over the next 3 to 5 years? And where can we? I'm sure it exists. Where is it?
So I can endeavor to answer that. And Jenny Ray, I ask if you wouldn't mind pulling up the most recent revenue assumptions. The proposed fiscal 24-25 budget, that is the budget for the next biennium, which we're having this discussion around so that we can recommend to the full council that it receives the support of both finance and workforce development. But Jenny Ray, could you answer Mr. Shirley's questions about the revenue assumptions for each of the various accounts and funds?
Yeah, and I was referring to, and I guess we could calculate that, but not revenue to the state, but
Okay.
yeah, just let me state another. Cannabis sales over the next 3 to 5 years.
So
So-
I'm looking at, okay, good. Well, let me just say that I'm looking at, according to the MJ Biz Daily, which is a source on cannabis revenues. I'm looking at U.S. cannabis industry total economic impact. I wish I could post this for you. It's for That's not helpful.
Yeah.
For 2021 to 2026, it looks as if between retail sales coupled with the additional economic impact, which is the multiplier effect, in 2022, it's expected to be a combined $100 billion to the US economy, and that's expected to grow to $200 billion in the next 5 years.
Wow. Okay. So
But Ginny Ray, do you want to just touch briefly on the assumptions that we have for Connecticut's revenue on cannabis?
I'm going to ask Jennifer Stevens to do that because she has access to the core. I have so right in front of me, I have very little information. I only have some of the current information. And for instance, the social equity innovation account, I know has about 28 million, maybe a little bit more in it now. And the regulatory and investment account has 10.8 million, which includes the $10 million in bond funding. And I don't have any of the other numbers. Jennifer, can you assist with that?
Yes. So we do have the numbers that we are collecting for licensings and fees, which are pretty steady, and we're collecting those as of 2 days ago. We're up to $28 million in the social equity innovation account.
I'm not asking for what we have, I'm asking for the projections.
Projections. Well, when retail sales begin,
Yeah.
we
mhm.
late this year or maybe early next year, yeah, the tax revenue is going to be a lot, a lot. And it's hard to predict right now, but we do have the numbers on how much percent of the tax of the retail sales. It just depends on how quickly we can get up and running and these shops open for business.
Okay, so I have I think we have the information. There are concrete projections for various revenues, whether they be from licensing or sales. So we do have those numbers. I know that OPM spent a lot of time when the legislation was first passed. So we'll circle back with you, Ed, but I know we have that information.
Thank you.
So just to continue to focus this discussion, so I think Kelly Marie put something concrete on the table, as did Chair Comer, and that is, how is it that we present? I think this is the question presented, and if anyone wants to modify it, Kyle's good at framing, these questions. Not to put you on the spot, Kyle, but I think that the issue presented for us is, the manner in which we kind of capture the resources that will be allocated for community investment or reinvestment and workforce development, whether those can be combined, whether the ratio ought to be changed. I think that's the question before us, and then we can get into the methodology.
Before you get into that, I'm sorry, I just wanted to flag that Councilman Walton has had his hand up for a while.
You're better at this, Chairwoman, than I am. I'm sorry, Mr. Walton.
No worries, thank you. And this is all so fascinating, but I did have a question, right? And given that it's gonna be a lot of money, I was wondering in terms of workforce development, is there an opportunity here for us to kind of professionalize this workforce, meaning whoever's doing the training, and is there if we can develop some sort of certificate, and it supports and it gives people an opportunity when they go for an interview or that it's like they went through an official process and were speaking the same language, and it kind of in the sense of professionalizing the industry itself.
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about workforce development, we're thinking about programs that are developed in partnership with industry partners, right? So they will have the opportunity to inform what skill sets they need for their employees. And we're working currently on our other workforce development initiatives that are federally funded, which we are not able to use any of these federal dollars towards the cannabis industry. But the way that we've gone about this is, again, to work with those employers to determine what it is, the skill sets they need, and then go back to our community colleges, our four-year institutions, any other, professional training providers, and work with them to develop programs. Now, there are currently programs developed in all forms of cannabis outside of Connecticut, and we'll be able to utilize those training programs to start with. But our Connecticut educational institutions have been working on and will continue to work on the development of cannabis programs within our institutions here. And the goal is to develop these certifications that are industry recognized, that can be attached to what we call stacking credentials, where someone can take that entry-level credential and they can, say, test out for credit and then start in a credit-bearing certificate program where they'll be able to earn credit certificates, associate degrees, and college degrees. One of our best applications that we received when we did the call for proposals for our Career Connect ARPA dollars was a university who wanted to put together a cannabis program. We were not able to fund them because it's federal dollars, but the goal here is to take the funds that we currently have in this year's budget, which is close to $4.5 million, and to send out a request for proposals for organizations to put together these training programs. We've had conversations with Sacred Heart, with UConn, with our community college system. So we have a lot of interested parties that want to put together and are in the process of putting together different levels of certification programs. But the goal here is to make sure that our employers are involved in that process. And until very recently, we are just starting to get employers identified through the licensing process. So when we have our full-time workforce development manager for cannabis on board, which we'll be able to post that position for hopefully next week and have someone on board in the next several months, we can start to organize the industry and start to have conversations with those organizations that have licenses and really be able to understand what their needs are and what their timelines are, and work to build out these programs.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I don't want to get too down into the weeds, so we could probably have further conversations, but just to be clear, just to be sure, so we're talking about going through universities and things of that nature. I wanted, hopefully, that we keep this like really affordable for the target audience, and as opposed to kind of making it degree. I mean, I imagine some may need some level of college readiness, whatever the case may be. But in my head, I was kind of picturing, the folks that have been impacted by the war on drugs and the folks who don't need to be priced out by having to go
absolutely.
to school and
Absolutely.
in college
So,
and get degrees and things of that nature. Because I'll speak directly to the teacher shortage, right? Because of the way we certify K-12 educators in Connecticut is old, right? It's obsolete, and now we have 1,200 vacancies in the state of Connecticut. So I just want to ensure that we're not pricing people out and things of that nature.
So in our Career Connect programs, and the way we like to run these is really targeted at those people who are underskilled and underemployed and unemployed, and reskill them. So all of the programs that our office is working on right now are non-credit bearing programs. They're typically 5 to say 16 weeks long, depending on what it is that they're studying. And they earn an industry recognized credential. But the goal is to ensure that that industry recognized credential that they earn, if they so choose to continue their education, either outside of employment or while they're employed, that they have opportunities to stack those credentials to move up the career ladder. So your point is very well taken, that these are very affordable programs. One of the other initiatives that our office is working on in partnership, and again, this is in developmental stage, is we're working with Chesla to develop a loan program for these less expensive, non-credit bearing training programs that people can apply for who don't meet the eligibility criteria for some of the income constrained programs, right? And a lot of this is with federal dollars, and this probably wouldn't impact so much the cannabis industry because we have the money coming in. But when we're thinking about people in impacted areas, not all of them are necessarily going to want to work in the cannabis industry. So we want to make sure that we're providing them opportunities outside of the cannabis industry. So, and this is more for general population as well, is a loan opportunity for them to get a loan through Chesla. The loan would include all of those wraparound services, and that part of the loan would be forgiven, and they would only pay back a portion of the tuition based on their income and being employed. So we are really focused on developing programs at all levels to ensure that those who really need the training most get it as fast as possible and as inexpensively as possible, but continue to have opportunities for job growth.
Thank you.
So with that said, if I could just focus the discussion around what resources ought to be reflected in the next biennial budget in order to accomplish those objectives. So is the 10 million figure the right figure, Kelly Marie? Or you had mentioned at the outset of this meeting some questions around timing. Can we just explore that a little bit?
I think that we could have a robust call for proposals. I'm proposing that we use the Career Connect framework because it works very well. We've already kind of worked out the bugs. That type of a call for proposals. I believe that some of our educational institutions may be looking for some funding to actually develop curriculum because they don't have curriculum already developed. And then we can have a multi-year end on this. So I'm looking at, a 2 to 3 years for them to not only just develop their programs quickly, within 6 months, but then be able to match employers' demand for workers at the same time, and so that we're running programs that meet the demand of employers. We don't want to train people and then say, okay, when a job is available sometime in the future, you're going to have the credentials to get that job, right? We want that job connected to the end of the training program. And if we do a call for proposals in a 3-year program, it gives people the opportunity, these institutions, the opportunity to build out the program and then to ramp up based on the needs as the needs ramp up. So, again, it's a little bit of speculation. Is $10 million the right number? I feel that it's a very comfortable number to really get programs developed and launched. But it's still a little bit of a moving target.
Chair Comer, then Kevin, then Ed.
Thank you. So a few thoughts, and I was just kind of looking to see if the Office of Fiscal Analysis had done anything around anticipated cannabis revenue, and I just found something. But again, it's going to be helpful to me to have a sense of how much money we're working with. And I know you put out the number from MJ Biz Daily, which is very helpful. But I have a few sort of cautionary thoughts. One is that Connecticut's program is somewhat unique in terms of how it's being implemented. Two, a lot of states that anticipated significant revenue now are facing some challenges, either because of oversupply, which has driven some businesses out of the market, because that drives the cost down. So I really would love to just have a better handle on what kind of money we're talking about. The other thing I wanted to mention was around the workforce training programs, and this is somewhat piggybacking on what Kevin said, and that is, as we think about how we develop these programs, I'm hoping that we are also considering partnering with community-based organizations that serve these communities specifically. Whether it's the Urban League or the Y or whoever, just so that there are entities that these communities have relationships with, feel comfortable with, because not everybody's going to just go to the community college or a post-secondary institution without some sort of facilitation.
Yes, I think that's an important component. And I think, I'm giving you little pieces of what we're doing, but overall with Career Connect, we're funding 14 community-based organizations across the state of Connecticut that are really focused on reaching the hardest to serve populations. And I think, that's really what we need to do with regards to any types of programming that we do here. And when we look at workforce development, I think we have to be really mindful that the technical training piece is the easy piece. That's the most simplistic piece. We know what the skills are that they need. We put together the technical training. The harder piece is really ensuring that those that we want to give this opportunity to are met where they're at with regards to their aptitude, social emotional well-being, to be able to be successful not only in a job training program, but on the job, and making sure that they have those employability skills that will ensure that they're successful, having the supports that they need to overcome those challenges that have precluded them from being successful in the job market in the past. And so that part, to your point, is really where these community-based organizations who are the boots on the ground in these communities become extremely important. And this is where we start driving the cost up, right? So like I said, the cost for the actual technical training component piece is probably somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000. But the other 5,000 or so really speaks to those supportive services and making sure that these dollars go to those community-based organizations who can do that work with those residents.
I'd like to jump in just to address the chair's questions about revenue. I did come across some information regarding OPM's projections for revenues for various purposes. And Madam Chair, so licensing fees, with the exception of conversion fees, was expected to generate 8.4 million, and those revenues would go into the cannabis regulatory and investment account. There was a separate projected line item for the social equity and innovation account, and that was intended to hold the proceeds from conversion licenses for both cultivators and dispensaries. That is anticipated, or was, assuming the launch of the cannabis market in May of 2022, that was anticipated to generate 25 million. And then for fiscal years 23 and 24, there's prevention and recovery services. I don't have projections there, but that should just give you a ballpark of the revenues that, at least at the time the legislation was enacted, those were the latest figures from OPM on what the revenues were projected to be. So I think it was Kevin, then Ed, then now Mark. Kevin?
Yeah, and I did just share, just so you know, an infographic that has, I think, the same information. I put it in the chat from Office of Fiscal Analysis. Sorry, thank you.
No, Madam Chair, my hand was still up. I couldn't get it off. I'm good.
Okay. Ed?
Thank you, Christine. The number that I understand, Kelly, what you were saying, I would just add that I think the more specific number is if it's $10,000 per trainee, per trained individual, the right number. Now, just anecdotally, it happens to be the number that certain large financial institutions pay for the training of people that are getting a Series 7 license. I mean, if that's $10,000 per trainee, per trained individual is what they pay. So it's somewhere in that number. 10,000 is likely, a reasonable number for training someone in technical skills. And the other number associated with that, 1,000 people, is that an appropriate? I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just asking the question. Is that the number that we feel comfortable with training in the first year, right? I mean, next year, can we train 1,000 people? I think it sounds as if the industry could swallow up 1,000 people fairly easily once they open up for recreation. Then the other question is just how many. What's the employee count for medical now? I mean, we've got what, four cultivators, is it?
We've got 4 producers and 18 dispensaries.
And 18 dispensaries. So what are they? What's their employee count? And then, more sensitively, how many of their employees are what we might who could qualify as social equity applicants if they were looking to be social equity applicants?
So I'll answer the first question first. With regards to $10,000 per, this figure is a historical figure through WIOA funding, our experience at OWS with CARES Act funding and a program that we ran at the beginning of the pandemic. So there's historical data around that number being, the right number.
Right number. Got it.
And then with regards to, the count of the current number of employees, I don't have that information. I think the only way to get that at this point in time is to survey those providers and those businesses and ask them if they can provide us a count. And I don't know, that would be voluntary to, provide that information, I think, but unless, Madam Chair, there's other, information that Department of Consumer Protections collects with regards to that, I wouldn't know that.
I can certainly check with our drug control director to see what kind of information that they capture around employee numbers. I mean, it is slightly different just because there's a different, when it comes to medical marijuana, there's certain skill requirements, pharmacists, for instance,
True.
that have to be on site, but I can certainly ask.
Okay.
And it really is speculative as a number of people. And can we recruit and train 1,000 people in the next year without a robust set of training programs already established? I mean, I think we can currently use a lot of the remote distance learning programs that are being run in other states that are proven to be high quality as we get our Connecticut educators up to speed. And some of those online programs might be very appropriate to continuing to be utilized. So, that 1,000 in the next year could be an ambitious number. With our Career Connect dollars, we're investing $60 million over 3 years to train 6,000 people over 3 years. So there's a number of people out there that need the jobs. There's about 100,000 people that are unemployed right now. Some of them are long-term unemployed and haven't really participated in the workforce in a long time. So getting them back into the workforce is a little more challenging than getting those that have historically kind of participated in the workforce. Our unemployment rate is very low. It's hovering around 3% right now.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, you've had your hand
Thanks,
up.
Christine. The topic of projected funds has been I think a topic that has been raised quite a lot in the last several weeks, and probably aligned with preparations and execution of last week's SEC Finance Committee meeting. And when I think OPM was asked for projected revenues, staff cited the governor's mid-year proposed budget, I think page 821, which lists the projected revenues. But I'm thinking that, given the traction and progress we made as a finance committee last week, it might be worth clarifying in the coming days, a delegation of responsibilities for both projections and tracking of revenues into the accounts. It sounds like the SEC accountant was able to cite revenues entering the accounts and are pretty proximate to current day. I think the projections and forecasts are going to likely vary based on updated data and other information that informs it, including go live dates and so on. So I don't have an answer today. I anticipated this would be a topic of great importance. And I do say to you, Christine, and others, that if we need to have an organizational logistical discussion about how among the various agencies and councils involved in this, we can ensure supply of reliable information. I'd like to be of assistance in sort of mapping out and helping to assign responsibilities so that up-to-date, reliable information is provided with the appropriate source.
You're on mute, Kristen.
That's much appreciated, Mark, and we'll continue to rely on the expertise of both OPM and DECD, where the SEC continues to be housed for administrative purposes. For everyone's benefit, the Finance Committee meeting to which Mark referred, where we really kind of deconstructed the various sources of revenue, and just really grateful for the continued support of DECD's budget folks. Your offer is appreciated, and I will just put it into context where we stand in terms of process. What we endeavor to do is have some confidence around a proposed budget that the full council will consider as endorsing as a request for the next biennium. By no means will it be, is it certain that every line item and the total amount asked for, we're not sure if that will be part of the governor's proposed budget, but it is a process that begins with the October 1st submittal. So it is a starting point to a conversation. And so if after October 1st, when that budget request is submitted, there are refinements to the projections, and that is something, there's plenty of time built into the process where we can make the appropriate adjustments.
Thank you very much, Kristen.
Sure. That's part of the reason why I'm so glad OPM has a designee on the Finance Committee. Are you kidding? That's one of the best things about the committee. So, and that is being able to get in real time input on how it is we should tighten up the budget. So with that said, Ginny Ray, I know that perhaps you can just quickly, I know we've spent some time on this, and I would like to draw this question or call the question, which is how it is we approach the appropriation or the budget request for both community reinvestment and workforce development. But before doing so, if you want to share any comments or thoughts on how, if we haven't covered it already, if it's already been discussed, you can pass, but I did want to give you the opportunity to offer your comments if you have anything which could give us some insights here.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. So a great deal of what is in the current proposed budget was covered today. I've had some extensive conversations with members of the council, including Kelly Marie, and I want to thank you very much for your suggestions and recommendations. I did send out the proposed budget to everyone with greater detail in the narrative section. So maybe I will offer, in the interest of time, if folks have any specific questions. But I can tell you that on the methodology, we used a variety of sources and information. So I can just highlight for you a little bit on the accelerator program. There's a cost there, but we also looked at possibly opening up the accelerator program to potential folks in the DIA who can participate in the program. So we raised the proposed cost for that program to 2.3 million, and then combining the reinvestment in the workforce development line items gives us greater flexibility in using these funds in the in preparing for reinvestment as well as training people. Someone mentioned, I believe it was Chairwoman Comer, we do plan in fiscal year 23, fiscal year 24, and fiscal year 25 to do a great deal of outreach around the community conversations and preparing for folks to give us their thoughts and ideas on what they would like the reinvestment to look like and what types of programs, what types of services, if it's shovel ready. So we do plan to do that. We are actually in the process of kind of waiting on the recertified map to kind of target the areas that we will go out to plan those conversations and to have those conversations. So we have 15 million in 2024 to be aggressive in reaching out and having multiple conversations with the community, conducting surveys, conducting charrettes, organizing folks, and then hopefully in planning for 2025 to actually start funding some of those plans that have been developed and implemented. I know personally, I would like to see before I leave the council, some ribbon cutting, some shovels in the ground, and some celebration of all of our work and getting reinvestment opened up. Other than that, we looked at the social equity application verification, and based on the total maximum numbers of licenses that could be issued, we estimated that there's about 126 licenses that would have some sort of a social equity component to it. And so going forward for application review, we have CohnReznick at about $440,000 over the 24-25. Like I said, just gauging the numbers that we've used so far in the first round that we expect in the first round of the lottery. In addition, I added another consulting services, 250,000 for 24 and 25, so that we could do some more research around census tract data, collecting information in the census tracts of the DIAs, so that we could have some really good, pure information for reinvestment purposes. Under the marketing and communications line, again,
So
we want.
if I could just stop you there, I really do want to
Mhm.
keep our discussion focused on the community reinvestment and the workforce development piece
Mhm.
in the interest of time. And one of the things I noted from the proposed budget that was circulated for this meeting is that it looks like the suggestion that Kelly Marie offered has already been reflected in this budget, and that is workforce development is a subset of the community reinvestment line item. Is that correct? Is that how you formatted it?
Yes.
Okay, so is that something that these two committees agree with? I agree with it, but this is different than what was initially circulated. So I just wanted to make sure that there's buy-in into that new structure. Are
If I
folks
just
okay with
can
that?
make one quick comment with regards to that, I think the thought of that gives you that level of flexibility. So I think to Chair Comer's original comment that we want to make sure that our communities have, input into how those funds are utilized. First we could educate them on the return on investment with regards to those dollars, and that's something that we can get started very quickly as we're ramping up some of their place-based investments. And so that just gives us that flexibility to be able to move. Is that $10 million for workforce really the right number? And we really don't have a solid answer for that right now. So some of that can be shifted back and forth based on priority.
Okay, is that is the consensus of this group? Can I get just like nods? No, nod. It's consensus. Okay. Again, this is just a committee recommendation. I'm sure it will be subject to fuller discussion. I know other members of the council who are not on these two committees have been focused on these matters as well. And Ginny Wright, just as a general matter, I note that for fiscal years 24 and 25, certainly under personal services, there's no change from 24 to 25. The numbers are identical without a growth factor. I just have never seen that. And I'm just wondering if that was intentional. And I noticed that there's under other expenses, likewise, there's no growth factor from one year to the next. And consulting and plan review, and so none of those items. So could you explain that?
That was intentional. These are projected numbers. We weren't quite sure what the revenues that we're going to have are. So we left them as the same pretty much for both years, with the exception of in O&E, an increase for the community investment and workforce. And then with travel and mileage, it was just an inflation increase.
Is that an approach that was recommended by the DECD budget folks?
We reviewed our budget with them. They didn't tell us to increase it one way or another in the years.
So I'm not a budgeting expert, but that looks somewhat unorthodox to me, but okay, that's fine. Are there any other questions? Ed, you have your hand up?
Yeah, let's see, I'm off mute, okay. So Kelly, you're saying then, for all intent and purposes, reinvestment and workforce development are considered in the same pot, shall we say, and reinvestment, community reinvestment is a subset of workforce development at this point, or is it the opposite?
The opposite, that
Okay.
workforce development is a subset of community development. It's an investment back into the community. So
Okay,
if we're looking at these dollars, we could say that they're pointed to people in the designated areas, affected areas.
okay, the only question I think intuitively, one looking at that would say, if you just looked at the numbers, you would think that the larger number is the set and the smaller number the subset. But I think what we're saying now is just the opposite, right?
Well, I think what we're saying is not breaking out a total for workforce development under community reinvestment, but having a line item there as
Okay.
as an amount that can be invested as part of the community reinvestment. And that gives us some flexibility to be able to truly understand what that investment should be, which and get us some more concrete numbers that we have now. And then we could have, subsequent votes on how we're going to spend the money under the community reinvestment.
So the only
Right.
other,
Go ahead.
No, I know what you're getting at, because it was workforce development, which had been anticipated at 10 million and community reinvestment at 2. And so, yeah, I agree with the kind of implicit in Mr. Shirley's comment. The question I had was the 30% increase from 24 to 25. That's fairly significant growth. Are there concrete plans to go with those growth assumptions? In other words, do we expect to be able to scale up from one year to the next by 30%? Is that how quickly we can anticipate?
Well, when I'm
an
thinking about
expansion?
this is we may not need to scale up that much, right? But if community investment is the top line item and workforce is under that, it gives us the ability to potentially invest more in place-based community improvements than in workforce and kind of be able to match the workforce with regards to the demand. So I think when you think about that, in year 1, there's some planning grants and things like that. In year 2, there's implementation and scale. So I think if we're looking at those two things together, that 35% increase is appropriate, and that you should be able to spend that as we implement and scale both place-based investments and community workforce investments.
can't wait to see what OPM's reaction is to this budget submittal. I mean, I just have no experience with such kind of imprecision. But you know, I'm sure they are very accustomed to this kind of fluidity. So I guess we'll just
Well, I know the
see.
private sector is, and I'm no expert at OPM's policies requirements, but you know, when I worked in budgeting in my own business, and sometimes I would have larger categories with other categories under that.
Okay, well, I've got a hard stop. So, but the work of this joint session should not stop on my account. I will leave it in your capable hands, Kelly Marie. But I do appreciate the opportunity for all of us to pose these questions. There's just one comment/request that I have of staff, and that relates to a request from Kyle, I think at the last Finance Committee meeting. And before we present the 24-25 biennial proposal to the full council, I think the suggestion was that there be one chart which has the budgeted amounts for fiscal 22, actuals for fiscal 22, same information for 23, budgeted and actuals, and then the proposed figures for 24 and 25. That will allow for us to kind of better understand. Ginny Ray, like for example, when you talked about at the outset of your comments, you referred to an increase for the accelerator program, an increase to 2.35 million. Well, it begs the question, an increase from what? And it helps us to understand the evolution. So if staff can finalize that format request that was presented when the Finance Committee last met, I suspect that would be helpful to the entire council as we consider all of these issues.
Okay.
And if you have any other questions on format, I'm sure either Kyle or me can guide staff on the preparation of that.
Okay.
All right, thank you all, and I'll get the cliff
Thank
notes
you.
afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, Christine.
So I think from here is, how does everybody feel about, you know, incorporating both of those into one line item to provide some flexibility between the two competing or both their equal priorities with regards to place-based community improvements and workforce development investments. So how do you all feel about putting them into that one category? And is that something you want to move forward and market? Is that something that could be acceptable, you think, to OPM?
Hey, I'm sorry, Kelly, could you, it seems that that's a term of art that I'm not familiar with, play space, because.
So the community types of investments that each community designs or wants to have done. So it could be a physical location of an improvement of a cityscape, or it could be the development of a community-based organization or community-based resource center or recreation center or something like that, right? More of capital improvements within their communities versus social improvements, which there could be those as well.
Got it. So it's not something that I can buy in Sears and Roebuck and put in a backyard. This is a real, because when you first said play space, that's what I was thinking of, but I get it now. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm still struggling because I'm not sure how this was handled in past years, but I'm inclined that I may have to abstain when the vote comes because of my dual role. So what I share is, you know, I guess I put forward that disclaimer. I guess what I'm struggling with is that the budget in front of us includes roughly $1 million for community reinvestment and 5.1 million for workforce. So if I were to look at that line in the budget, I would say this line includes a budgeted amount of up to $1 million for community reinvestment, and then up to 5.1 for workforce. I don't see how, if they're on separate lines, they would sort of be merged or a subset of the other. I guess you could say, with the discretion of the SEC's implementation of its appropriated budget, it could determine that within that 5.1 million. I guess that's the only concern I have. It feels like the community reinvestment is a broader umbrella, but it's also the smaller amount, whereas workforce development is a smaller component, but amount. So
I think that's where we're trying to say, like, do we move away from that?
yeah,
Right?
merge.
And do we just merge them together and say, under community reinvestment,
Yep.
these are the types of programs that fall under community reinvestment, and that the SEC Council, with feedback from the communities, would determine
Yep.
what programs were going to be funded utilizing those funds, in workforce development would be included. So instead of having a workforce line item called out that's much larger,
I agree.
it now is part of.
I appreciate that. I was struggling to align the Excel sheet in front of me and the description in the meeting. So thank you very much for clarifying. Yes, I think that I think that provides the flexibility it sounds like we want to have. That the chair said it wisely earlier. We don't want to set the table for the community. We want there to be a process for identifying the funds to be allotted. I think a question for us to think about as a council, it may not be at this meeting, but maybe along the way through the legislative process, is whether there ought to be some language in legislation that identifies some priorities by a designated amount or percentage. I know it's hard because we're not sure what to anticipate would be the investment, but I think that's something you might want to just prepare for. There being a desire for within the council or externally for greater clarity about what are the set asides, what are the priorities for the funding. I don't have the answer for that now or a roadmap, but might be a question we have to prepare for.
Is it reasonable to expect that early on in year 1, year 2, that the requirement for workforce development in order to get the industry up and running would be higher than it will be in the later years? I mean, that's how I see it. You're trying to get this industry up. You're trying to train people. And so I would think that looking at the industry as a single business, you would put that capital in. The capital required early on is likely to be more than the capital required later. So to Mark's point, if you're looking at a one bucket, if you will, and one, the two items in that bucket are likely to change over time. So you would expect that, early on we've got requirements for workforce development. Later on, we will have more capital for community reinvestment and less need for workforce development, I would think, in order to keep the industry running. I mean, there'll always be a demand for people who want to be trained, but the actual need for the industry is likely to diminish, say, in year 5 or so.
I would agree with that assumption.
And I think that's, sort of piggybacking on Mark's point, that would, I guess, why would we not have the larger line item be the community reinvestment and a smaller line item be for workforce development? And then if we need to add to the workforce development because there's a demonstrated need, then we can do that, as opposed to putting it out there that we have this expectation. I'm just still really struggling with this large chunk when I have not yet heard with any that gives me any comfort level that we know what the demand's going to be. And we know what the, because we haven't talked to anybody. So we don't know from the industry what the workforce's needs are going to be. Because some of these folks, you know, some folks may already be working in this industry, so the need may not be as great. So, you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I do think that, you know, and again, to Christine's point, it's going to end up being vetted by OPM anyway. But I just think that if we're going to make this claim, then it has to be substantiated with some data and some facts.
Well, I think, you know, to the point of putting them in one bucket, that gives you the flexibility to say that we're only going to utilize the workforce development dollars as required, and we're not making an assumption ahead of time as to how much money is going to workforce development, that it's yet to be determined.
Okay.
But the pot of money is for community reinvestment. We're not, and we're saying community reinvestment.
Just generally with no line. Okay.
Right. And then underneath it, you'll have acceptable expenditures under that without a dollar amount. Like workforce development is one of the community reinvestment categories, but we're not putting a dollar amount on that.
Okay.
And that gives us that flexibility, as you said, to be able to make those investments as we need to, and that we're not looking at making an assumption that is not based on enough information. We all agree to that. And I don't feel comfortable making an assertion that $10 million this year and $15 million next year is the right number, because we don't have enough information. But if we put it in a category and say that it's flexible use of those dollars based on the information that we have, I think that gives us that flexibility.
Thank you for the clarity.
So where are we now? Do we all agree? I think that is how we're gonna make the presentation moving forward next week. And we keep the line item that high. We include the workforce originally allocated 10 million and then the 2 million. So it would be 12 million this year. And whatever the additional increases for those two categories next year would just fall under community reinvestment.
So you're saying 12 million, repeat that please, Kelly, so I can understand what 12 million is.
Yeah. So if we look at the budget,
Yeah.
we have a line item for 2024 that's $2 million for community reinvestment. And we have a separate line item that's $10 million for workforce development.
Okay.
We put those into one category, community reinvestment, with workforce development as a listed category underneath it without a dollar allocation towards it. So that would mean if we're combining those two line items, that overall it would be $12 million investment in community reinvestment.
And that will be our explanation at the meeting, because someone will certainly ask, what's the differentiation between the two? You know, I mean, that's just, I would ask if I didn't know.
Right. And I think that differentiation is what is the required demand on those dollars for the next 2 years. And we'll make those investments based on that demand and input from our DEI communities, and the Social Equity Council would approve the expenditures. I would imagine that the Social Equity Council is going to approve all expenditures under community reinvestment.
So you can dial one up and one down depending on what you need. And the rationale is that workforce development is a form of community investment.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I'm comfortable with that.
Kyle?
Yeah, I guess I'm comfortable with it too, with a few very strong caveats. I think for one, we need a better, as Chairwoman Comer said, we need a better understanding of these estimates and our projections on workforce needs. Two, I think we need better projections on the revenue estimates. Those need to be updated, and we need a better understand how much money is going to be coming in that we're actually going to be able to spend. Otherwise, this is for naught. And then thirdly, my biggest caveat is I understand this is just a starting place, and we're going to be going through a very long budgeting season. And I just want to make sure by the time February, March comes around and we're in front of Appropriations Committee, we're able to justify all of these numbers and our requests to the legislature, in addition to our OPM secretary as they negotiate this budget. So I think, yes, we should keep this process moving forward, but I do think there's a lot more work to do on this budget.
I agree with you 100%, Kyle, on all points made. I think that's why it's also very important that we get our cannabis workforce development people on board as quickly as possible so that they can really be helpful in gathering all of the demand information and helping to build out what those programs are. Okay.
So
Are we
mean,
good?
I think we're comfortable making this presentation to the full board. Is that correct? I am, but I'm just asking other people. I actually think the need will be greater, but you know, that's just me. And the opportunity is even greater than that. I mean, a 3.5 multiplier effect
Huge.
on over $1 billion in one state, and a small state at that. It's huge.
I have to get ready for another meeting at 3:30, so I'm going to go ahead and leave. But thanks everyone for this awesome conversation. I think we're really making progress here.
Thank
Are we
you.
ready to conclude this
All right,
meeting?
everyone.
Yep. Thank you, Kelly. Really
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
everyone. Appreciate the discourse and the conversation. I think it was a great meeting.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Good night,
Janet, too.
everyone.
Thank you. Take care.